Well, we've had a week now to digest Victoria's lockdown extension, and it's been met with criticisms, including from regional Victorians in coronavirus-free zones who have been living under tough Stage 3 restrictions. All this as the stoush at the borders intensifies, leading to a more frayed relationship between the state and federal governments.
Well, let's bring in our poly panel now with Liberal MP Tim Wilson, who joins us from Melbourne. Labor MP Josh Wilson joins us now from Perth. Tim, if I could start with you. Now, you have really taken issue with Victoria's curfew from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. You've written to the Australian Human Rights Commission to look into whether the curfews were a violation of people's rights and freedoms. Given this is a pandemic, a very serious pandemic, it's a bit extreme, isn't it, to call in the Human Rights Commission?
Not at all. The reality is the state government put forward that the curfew was necessary to protect public health and to make sure the best interests of Victorians. The Chief Health Officer came out and said it wasn't required. Then we were told it was on the basis of police order to maintain public order, and the police came out and said, no, we didn't request it either. The simple reality is we need to make sure that measures are necessary, sustainable to maintain public confidence, and when they're not, they should go. That's why regional Victoria is so angry. That's why people increasingly in Victoria are angry, because they realise that there are measures in place that are not necessary, not justified, and have been sold to us on a deception.
Tim, whilst the Victorian Chief Health Officer Brett Sutton wasn't consulted on the curfew, but when asked about it on radio, he said he hadn't really had time to reflect on it, but that it had probably been useful. Shouldn't we take that on board?
Well, there are lots of things that are useful. It's whether it's necessary. I don't think politely people in New South Wales, and I'm sure Josh will get his chance, understand what it's like to be in Victoria, where you're locked in your home essentially 23 hours a day, where we're restricted to moving 5 kilometres. Now, people are prepared to take proportionate, necessary measures to stop the spread of COVID-19. What we're not prepared to do is have measures introduced on deception and measures introduced that are not necessary, that significantly curtail people's capacity to go about their lives.
Josh Wilson, if I could bring you into this conversation as well. Dan Andrews has really been criticised over the issue of the curfew in particular. What is the Labor Party's gauge of how Dan Andrews is performing as a Labor Premier?
Well, the gauge has to be the results. I mean, a month ago, there were 750 infections a day. I think today it's under 40. There were nearly 8,000 Victorians infected. Today it's around 1,300. So the actions being taken by Premier Dan Andrews and the people of Victoria, showing an enormous amount of discipline and forbearance, have been successful in dealing with this second wave. And we know what this virus is like when it gets off the leash. Lots of people get sick very quickly. Some of them will have lasting health consequences. Some of them won't survive. So, you know, you look at the whole package. I hear what Tim's saying. Of course, we want restrictions to ease as soon as possible, and we want measures to be necessary measures. But we're not in a situation of perfect knowledge. This is a virus that none of us have ever seen before. And I think what the leadership in Victoria, Premier Dan Andrews, his other ministers and all the agencies involved, and the people of Victoria are doing a fantastic job, and that's good for Victorians and it's good for all of us, and I pay tribute to the people who have taken on sacrifices. We are seeing, I think, unfortunately, at the national level, a sort of a game where the federal leadership, the Prime Minister and other ministers are looking each and every day for a Labor Premier that they can attack for restrictions. We don't hear about Tasmania or South Australia or New South Wales. It's always Mark McGowan or Anastasia Palaszczuk or Dan Andrews. I don't think that is national leadership.
Well, Josh, let's talk about that, because obviously these relationships are being thrust into the spotlight with respect to the borders. Scott Morrison says, or has said this week, that Australia is at risk of losing its humanity with respect to a case of a young 26-year-old woman who was denied permission to attend her dad's funeral. She was allowed to visit her father after that. Matthias Cormann has used even stronger words: cold-hearted, harsh, nasty. Do you think we should be seeing more compassion from our state leaders and health officers when it comes to borders?
We always want to see compassion, but what's the main game? We've got this never-seen-before virus that is a killer. When it gets loose, it's like wildfire. People get sick in in really high numbers really fast. It gets into aged care and it takes away our loved ones. If we don't respond with appropriate measures, we see rising infections. Some of those people are going to end up with lifelong health consequences, and we see more and more funerals. So that's the main game.
But I guess, sorry to interrupt, the issue has been is that there is a perception that some people have been given exceptions, say movie stars, AFL hierarchy, and others haven't.
Well, there's a system in place that is being applied rigorously across Australia. People draw contrast between individual cases, which are heartbreaking. I mean, I have enormous sympathy for the young woman in Queensland and for her family. But there are no shortage of those cases. And local members like myself and Tim around the country, we know of cases like that at both ends of the spectrum, involving people who are having babies and can't be with their family, people who are losing loved ones and can't be with their family. But if we pick a single example and we decide to go on radio in order to have a crack at the Premier of Queensland on one day and the Premier of Victoria on the other day, I think you can see what feeds that. And I don't think that helps build confidence, the kind of confidence that Tim is talking about. We have to have in the measures that are being taken.
Tim, I wonder if perhaps at the start of all of this, we just should not have even entertained this special exemption issue. As Kath said, you know, AFL stars are able to move across borders. Celebrities, Hollywood stars are able to go into state borders without even quarantining as well. Should we have just done away with the special exemption and perhaps consider compassionate exemptions instead?
Well, I think it's always difficult to get the balance right in these measures, but I do think it needs to be justified when measures are taken to give people special privileges to operate outside the law. Now, the reality is, I think when you see a family member who's got a loved one on the other side of a border dying, you know, there are proper and proportionate measures that can be taken to make sure they protect everybody's interests. But as a blanket proposition, look, I had to go on quarantine in Canberra for 2 weeks. I'm going to have to do it at the end of next week for exactly the same reason, to protect the public health and interests of the people of the ACT. So I think you've got to have a compelling case to adjust the rules and recognise that.
Tim, is it a bit rich that we've got the federal government at odds with the state leaders for closing their borders when we've got thousands of Australians overseas unable to get home? There's a report in The Guardian today saying Peter Dutton's Border Force approved Tom Hanks' return to Australia.
But this is why I believe that we need to have rules that are tested and proportionate. Now, of course, if somebody needs to come back home, then they have to do it through the staying processes around quarantining and the like. And I've been outspoken in saying I think we need to provide the pathway for Australians to return home. But the tragedy, the reality of why it's so difficult to get Australians home at the moment is because the Victorian government has shut down Melbourne Airport, shut down the second busiest pathway to get back into our country, shut down hotel quarantine. And if we want to address the issues around getting Australians overseas home, we've got to get Melbourne Airport open.
We want to move on now to another headline that really made the headlines, I suppose, this week, and that is the expulsion of Rio Tinto's top executives, the CEO and two top executives. Well, they've resigned over the destruction of the Yukon Gorge caves in the Pilbara. Josh, but what is in place, though, to ensure that mining companies don't make this same mistake over again?
Well, we don't have an effective national protection framework for Indigenous cultural heritage, so we need to get on and fix that. The Western Australian government is changing the state laws, and that's welcome. But what we haven't seen in this case so far is accountability from the government. We know there were failures in the Minister's office. The Minister for the Environment, Susan Lee, was contacted by the traditional owners before the blast. That call was ignored. They were not responded to. The department wasn't engaged to provide advice to the traditional owners. Now, that's a failure, and that needs to be acknowledged if we're going to improve our system. And there's a larger failure too, because at the Commonwealth level, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Heritage Protection Act is not effective and it's not sufficient. The government knows that because its own strategy documents, the Heritage Strategy in 2015, the Northern Australia White Paper, they both said we've got to review and reform this act. And in fact, at one point, the government committed to doing that by the end of 2017, but it hasn't happened. So there are those two failures in the Minister's office and systemically. Those things need to be fixed if we're to be sure that we don't lose Indigenous cultural heritage of immeasurable value.
And just briefly, and finally, we're almost out of time. Tim, do you think that there is scope for the federal government to be more involved in Aboriginal heritage protection, or do you think that agreements made under the native title system should be the basis for managing Aboriginal cultural heritage?
Well, I believe that the first people who should be able to take control and manage the cultural sites, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultural sites of the country, are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who have native title claims. Now, can there be more done to fix up federal law? I'm sure that's right. As Josh has admitted himself, there are errors and shortcomings in state law. So this is a tragedy. It's something that we need to address and fix to make sure that it isn't repeated, because traditional owners and traditional custodians of cultural sites should be protected.
Tim Wilson and Josh Wilson, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining Weekend Breakfast this morning.